In the final moments of the Second World War, as the storm descended upon Bergen Belsen, you will witness a living hell. More than 13,000 corpses without a single grave, and nearly 60,000 souls awaiting death from starvation and disease. Amid that sea of blood, 3 SS women, Irma Grese, Elisabeth Vulkenrath, and Johanna Borman turned horror into a stage of brutality, calmly executing their fellow humans without a trace of remorse. The subsequent trial stripped away every secret, shaking the world's understanding of human nature and justice. If you are curious about what mysteries lie behind this curtain of hell, do not look away. Click subscribe to the channel to discover the full, harrowing, and profound story. And share where you are watching from in the comments below, because every perspective of yours is valuable. In the final days of the Second World War, the Bergen Belsen concentration camp became an unimaginable nightmare. When British and Canadian troops reached its gates, they beheld more than 13,000 corpses lying unburied and scattered everywhere. Nearly 60,000 prisoners, gaunt and half alive from starvation and disease, hovered on the fragile boundary between life and death. The sight of the dead and the living confined together erased all lines of humanity, leaving soldiers from every division stunned and horrified. Bergen Belsen was established in 1940 to detain prisoners of war. However, from 1943, when the SS assumed partial control, it ceased to function merely as a detention center and evolved into a sophisticated killing mechanism. Poverty, lack of medical care, and atrocious sanitation were wielded as silent weapons, allowing prisoners to perish one by one. The camp's tripartite Division I sector for prisoners of war, one for general habitation, and one for regular detainees revealed the brutal efficiency of the Nazi regime's segregation by race, nationality, or political ideology. Unlike Auschwitz, which operated gas chambers, Bergen Belsen killed by willful neglect, food shortages, medical deprivation, and outbreaks of pulmonary tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery turned disease into a silent executioner. When the camp population swelled tenfold in a single year, under the command of Joseph Kramer, later dubbed the Belsen Monster, the horrors intensified. Streams of new arrivals, combined with systematically reduced rations, pushed thousands to the brink of collapse. Overcrowded huts brimming with bodies and dried-out trenches filled with refuse depicted a scene akin to hell on earth. Hunger and epidemics forged this place into a one-way prison. Those who entered with hope left only with hollow eyes. Some died beside barbed wire fences. Others collapsed in courtyards, their corpses covered in dust. The suffocating stench of death, the relentless hacking coughs, and the feeble cries of the dying blending with the wind whistling through steel mesh created a tragic tableau of deliberate abandonment. When the Allied bugles sounded, the fate of 90,000 souls nearly erased was revealed to the world for the first time. Bergen Belsen stands not only as a symbol of massacre, but as proof of genocide through the cruelty of living conditions. Amid the desolation, death quietly traversed the camp's barracks, each step of a British soldier evoking boundless sorrow. This was the borderland of life and death, where survival and annihilation stood eyelash apart. Hunger, disease, and appalling sanitary conditions became the deadly trinity within the camp. Bergen Belsen was built to hold approximately 10,000 people. But by the time of liberation, it was overcrowded with more than 60,000 prisoners crammed into straw huts and wooden barracks. Many were so exhausted that one could not distinguish who was breathing and who had silently perished among the debris and fellow corpses. Some lay scattered beside unshrouded bodies, while others, never granted a final farewell, had already fallen victim to starvation and filth. The prisoners' diet was reduced to the bare minimum: a coarse cassava cake and a little water mixed with impurities, insufficient to sustain life. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent, and nurses and doctors lacked the strength to care for the sick. This was not mere neglect, but a death by abandonment deliberately orchestrated from the highest levels. As provisions were continuously cut to exterminate inmates without resorting to gas chambers, the combination of starvation with outbreaks of pulmonary tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery swept through the camp, turning disease into an invisible executioner that claimed dozens of lives each day. As Allied forces advanced into northern Germany, Heinrich Himmler ordered that Bergen Belsen offer no resistance. The motive was not mercy or humanitarianism, but to avoid pointless losses, as Nazi defeat became inevitable. On the 11th of April 1945, British and Canadian troops established a neutral zone around the camp, forbidding gunfire and prisoner movement. This decision was a tactical ruse by the Nazi regime to maintain control of fortifications, gun emplacements, and barbed wire fences without shedding blood over a lost cause. When the Allies finally entered the camp, what shocked them was not only the sight of corpses and emaciated inmates, but also the large presence of SS guards. Kramer, later nicknamed the Belsen Monster, stood in uniform, claiming he remained to maintain order. That declaration sounded grotesque amid the sea of blood and suffering permeating every corner. The image of the commander raising his hand in salute to Allied troops, as though greeting comrades, underscored the brazenness of their crimes. They did not flee, showed no remorse, and remained indifferent to the human cost inflicted around them. When Allied forces officially entered Bergen Belsen, a BBC correspondent sent back a shocking report. Across more than 1 acre, the dead and the living lie intermingled. One cannot distinguish who is who. Those with the faintest breath rest beside corpses, while the procession of skeletal figures moves like ghosts, without any hope of life. That image was seared into the world's consciousness. Infants born only to endure suffering, many of them dying within a few days of birth. One distraught mother knelt before a British soldier, begging for milk for her child, only to discover the baby had long since perished when she unwrapped its swaddling. The Allied response was at once urgent and chaotic. Medical teams were immediately deployed to establish field first aid stations and organize the transport of survivors to makeshift hospitals. Simultaneously, orders were issued that all SS guards must assist in burying the thousands of corpses, both as a relief effort and as instant retribution. This forced confrontation aimed to have the perpetrators face the brutal consequences of their actions, while swiftly removing the epidemic threat posed by decomposing bodies. Amid the turmoil, some prisoners still had the strength to rise up and attack SS warders as they were compelled to unearth their comrades' remains. Yet a few SS men reacted violently, opening fire on starving inmates, scrambling for scarce food supplies. That brief skirmish erupted in front of the camp's munitions depot, heightening tensions and forcing British troops to intervene decisively to quell the unrest and protect the survivors. Confronted with a typhus outbreak sweeping the camp, the British employed armored vehicles equipped with flamethrowers to burn down the disease-ridden barracks and eradicate infection reservoirs. At the same time, they established centralized delousing stations, sanitation camps, using chemical disinfectants to process and decontaminate the surviving prisoners. Although harsh, these measures helped contain the epidemic, saving many lives that might otherwise have been lost without proper care. These rapid medical interventions and immediate punitive actions yielded mixed results. They rescued a portion of the camp's surviving population while compelling the criminals to reckon with their crimes. Thousands were transported for treatment. The remainder were left forever entombed among the ruins and corpses. Throughout it all, the sight of British soldiers using loudspeakers to compel perpetrators to bury bodies, interspersed with the flickering flames of flamethrower tanks, stood as a stark testament to a humanitarian tragedy woven from both outrage and compassion. Amid that harrowing scene, the questions arose, not only how could human lives be abandoned so completely, but also, how could people act with such ruthless indifference? The Allies' decisive actions saved many souls. Yet they also underscored the haunting depths of cruelty wielded by those who once held life and death power. In that moment of liberation, both humanity's wounds and its fragile hope were laid bare. Immediately after the basic medical crisis was brought under control, the Allied investigative team began reviewing all camp personnel at Bergen Belsen. They identified approximately 500 staff members, among whom 45 serious offenders, including female soldiers previously considered peripheral elements, were brought to trial from September to November 1945. Public opinion was horrified to learn that the list of perpetrators included women such as Irma Grese, Elizabeth Vulkenrath, and Johanna Borman, proving that atrocity knows no gender. They were not coerced into participation. On the contrary, they advanced step by step, actively choosing positions to increase both power and cruelty. Irma Grese, born on the 7th of November 1923 in rural Germany, lost her mother at the age of 13 after her mother committed suicide upon discovering her husband's infidelity. Orphaned, she found a sense of family and purpose in Nazi ideology as the movement gained momentum. Before turning 15, Irma left school to work as a military nurse in an SS field hospital. In 1941, she sought to join the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, but was opposed by her father, which only strengthened her resolve for independence. Within 2 years, as a volunteer at Ravensbrück, a specialized training camp for female guards, she demonstrated efficiency and ideological zeal. Earning a promotion to supervisor at the age of 19, Elizabeth Vulkenrath, born Elizabeth Mello, came from a poor working-class family. After completing basic education, she worked as a nanny and a traveling hairdresser from 1933 to 1938. Gradually, Elizabeth was drawn by the promise of order and stability offered by the party, and in October 1941, she voluntarily enlisted in the SS Women's Corps at Ravensbrück. She received training in surveillance and prisoner control, then requested a transfer to Auschwitz-Birkenau in March 1942, a camp with greater opportunities for advancement, where she quickly gained attention for her severe disciplinary measures. Johanna Borman, born on the 10th of September, 1893 in Birkenfeld, East Prussia, grew up in a devout Protestant family and participated in missionary activities. When the war broke out, she was over 40 years old and had no lifelong Nazi indoctrination, but chose to join the SS for economic reasons. She began as a civilian logistics worker at Lichtenberg. The first official women's camp then was transferred to Ravensbrück when Lichtenberg's function changed. Unlike Grese or Vulkenrath, Borman was not indoctrinated as a youth. Yet, she developed equal ruthlessness. From working in the kitchen, she gradually took on external control roles, showing callous indifference to prisoners' suffering until she became a merciless butcher. These three profiles reveal the professionalism and initiative of female perpetrators. They not only followed orders, but sought to climb the power hierarchy, employing brutal methods and personalizing suffering. The presence of Grese, Vulkenrath, and Borman among the accused stunned public opinion and shattered assumptions about women's marginal role in the genocidal apparatus. This identification phase laid the groundwork for subsequent trials, where justice would demand each individual pay the price for their crimes regardless of gender or age. At Ravensbrück and later at Birkenau, these three women did not merely obey orders from their superiors. They personally devised some of the most savage torture methods. Irma Grese, nicknamed Little Wolf, trained a pack of German shepherds to attack prisoners on her command. She also took part in prisoner selections, using a woman's beauty as the criterion to decide who would live and who would die. Her jealousy stemmed from the belief that those more attractive than herself must be eliminated to satisfy her envy. At the sound of dogs barking and prisoners' panicked screams, Irma Grese would beam with satisfaction, lashing victims with a leather whip until they bled and trampling them with her studded boots, watching them writhe in agony across the camp yard. Elisabeth Vulkenrath became infamous for her deadly strikes. With a rubber baton, she organized group exercise sessions that forced prisoners to run and jump without pause until they collapsed, only to be beaten further until they lost consciousness. Vulkenrath also perfected the prolonged kneeling punishment. The prisoner was compelled to kneel, holding a stolen Weitable overhead, while Vulkenrath and fellow SS guards surrounded her, delivering blows in a mob until she collapsed, frothing at the mouth. Uncertain whether she would survive another day, Johanna Borman earned the title Queen of the Dogs by employing a hunting dog as her personal executioner. She would unleash it on frail prisoners, reveling as it tore at their flesh, and force others to witness the gruesome spectacle as a terror tactic. On one occasion, Borman ordered her dog to maul a prisoner with a leg injury, letting the animal rattle the wound and eliciting terrified screams from onlookers. After each operation, she fed the dog pieces of the prisoner's flesh right before the remaining inmates, asserting her absolute dominance. Those horrific scenes were seared into survivors' memories, becoming the darkest nightmares of their imprisonment. Their trajectories illustrate the shift from ordinary civilians to serial killers. They chose the role of guard, sought promotions by zealously carrying out orders and innovating new forms of violence, and ultimately developed signature killing techniques. Their eagerness to participate and the delight they took in others' suffering demonstrate that the concentration camp system did not merely tolerate cruelty, but actively encouraged and even rewarded sadistic behavior. These female guards climbed the ranks through their brutality, earning recognition and, to some extent, reward from their superiors for executing the extermination policy without gas. When British-Canadian forces completed establishing a neutral zone around Bergen Belsen and advanced into the camp's interior, they confronted unprecedented chaos. More than 13,000 corpses strewn everywhere, intermingled with tens of thousands of emaciated prisoners. many of whom had collapsed from hunger and disease. Immediately, those survivors still able to stand identified the 3 female guards Irma Grese, Elisabeth Vulkenrath, and Johanna Borman, along with numerous other SS personnel. The living prisoners quickly denounced their crimes, prompting British officers to order the immediate arrest of the entire guard contingent still wearing filthy uniforms. Not content with mere detention, the Allies compelled the perpetrators themselves to participate in the work they had abandoned, digging mass graves, removing shrouds from the dead, and burying thousands of victims under strict British supervision. Photographs capturing Grese, Vulkenrath, and Borman trudging through the camp in tattered uniforms, shoulders bearing the weight of fellow human beings, spread around the world. Grese wore a haughty expression, her eyes filled with contempt as she hurled bodies into pits. Vulkenrath looked visibly exhausted, vomiting repeatedly at the overpowering stench of death, while Borman labored with cold determination, dragging corpses under the weak sunlight. These images caused a global public uproar. The sight of guards once glorified in propaganda, now forced to bury their own victims, struck a chord. This was not simply a temporary reprisal, but the Allies' method of gathering irrefutable, living evidence, proof no one could deny. The burial operation proceeded urgently over several consecutive days, serving both as an emergency medical measure to prevent epidemic spread from decomposing bodies and as a form of on-the-spot justice, compelling perpetrators to face the horrific consequences of their actions directly. British soldiers kept detailed logs of the number of graves dug and the names of those forced to dig, and they preserved thousands of photographs and reels of film to serve as evidence in the forthcoming military trials. The aftermath of those scenes dominated headlines in Britain and across Europe. Public debate erupted over women's roles in war crimes, once assumed to be peripheral elements. These 3 female guards shattered stereotypes by demonstrating cruelty equal to that of their male counterparts. Discussions about individual responsibility, gender and violence, and the nature of justice spread through the press, political circles, and post-war conferences. The image of 3 women in filthy uniforms carrying prisoner bodies, bowed under the weight of their deeds, and under the world's outraged gaze, became a powerful symbol of justice and accountability. This was not only an immediate punitive measure, but also the first step in a legal process. The records and images from the burial operation became incontrovertible evidence, paving the way for trials that would hold those responsible to account for collective suffering. Immediately after, the female guards and camp staff were detained. They were placed in separate interrogation rooms under the supervision of the British-Canadian investigative team. The cramped spaces were dimly lit, casting a pale glow on the weary faces of those who had once unleashed terror. Interrogators confronted each woman in turn about her role in systematic killing operations, from participating in selections, sending victims to the gas chambers, to personal torture methods, to the confiscation of food and medical supplies. Every question was recorded, both audio and video, and meticulously logged. Irma Grese steadfastly denied all responsibility for executions. She insisted she had only followed orders and never participated directly in the selections. Grese claimed she was merely an administrative clerk, not trained to torture prisoners. Elisabeth Vulkenrath echoed the same defense. She knew nothing of any homicidal intent and regarded her duties purely as office work. Without deeper involvement in brutality, Johanna Borman went so far as to assert that her hunting dog was an innocuous pet, never trained to attack humans, and that she could not be held responsible for any violent outbursts. However, investigators swiftly gathered a wealth of survivor testimonies detailing shocking specifics. Grese personally trained dogs to tear at flesh. Vulkenrath beat prisoners with a rubber baton until they lost consciousness. Borman ordered her dog to attack critically ill inmates. Hundreds of statements were collected, with witnesses recounting every lash of the whip and each desperate scream. Crucially, photographs taken by British personnel during the burial operations revealed dog bite marks and whip lacerations on prisoners' bodies, providing clear evidence, contradicting the guards' claims. To strengthen the case file, investigators compiled individual dossiers matching identification photos with images from the camp. They analyzed wounds on prisoners and corpses, cataloging whip marks, boot-studded impressions, and canine bite patterns. Meanwhile, preserved tissue samples underwent genetic testing to confirm the identities of both perpetrators and victims. Forensic specialists reviewed the test results, ensuring no denial could obscure the truth. The guards' feeble denial strategies quickly unraveled in the face of overwhelming evidence. Grese was compelled to admit her use of hunting dogs in attacks and participation in selections. Vulkenrath conceded that she had beaten prisoners into unconsciousness and maintained control over food storages. Borman ultimately acknowledged employing her dog as an instrument of punishment, though she continued to claim ignorance of its lethal impact. All interrogation records were translated into German and English to form the basis of the formal indictment. With the preliminary questioning complete, the investigative team moved on to assembling documentary evidence, photographs, audio recordings, and medical reports. Every piece was carefully cataloged and classified in preparation for the forthcoming military trial at Lüneburg, where the accused would finally face justice for their crimes. The military trial at Lüneburg lasted more than 2 months, from mid-September to late November 1945. Before a council of British and Canadian generals with a British colonel presiding as chief judge, the indictment comprised 2 primary groups of charges: the massacre and starvation of prisoners at Bergen Belsen, and the torture and murder of women and children at Auschwitz-Birkenau over more than 50 days of hearings. The court presented film footage and photographs taken on the day of liberation, showing emaciated prisoners alongside piles of corpses, creating living evidence that could not be denied. Dozens of survivors were summoned to testify, recounting each whipping, each horrific selection, and the times dogs were unleashed on the infirm. Their testimonies were detailed to the level of individual lash marks and bite wounds, leaving many defense attorneys silent before the weight of the truth. International press and television descended on Lüneburg, broadcasting live images of the 3 female defendants and their accomplices, shocking public opinion around the globe. War crimes experts noted that this was the first time women were tried on equal footing with men for war crimes, ushering in a new era of international criminal accountability. In their defense, counsel for the 3 argued that their clients had merely carried out orders within the rigid hierarchy of the SS and Gestapo, emphasizing coercion, threats, and intimidation from superiors. They sought to show that the female guards had no right to refuse and had acted under existential pressure. However, the tribunal rejected this argument, affirming the inviolable principle that every individual is responsible for his or her own actions regardless of orders from the highest authority. This verdict marked a pivotal development in international law, establishing that criminal responsibility cannot be negated by gender, age, or rank. In delivering the judgment, the presiding judge emphasized that the existence of the concentration camp and its methods of killing, whether by starvation, torture, or trained animals, were the result of deliberate, sophisticated personal actions. The conviction of the 3 female guards shattered the stereotype of women's supporting roles in wartime crimes, proving that cruelty transcends any biological or social boundary. The Lüneburg trial became a symbol of international justice, affirming that even in war, human dignity and personal moral principles must never be violated. Ultimately, the sentences imposed served not only as punishment, but also as a powerful message. All acts of crimes against humanity will be punished. Regardless of the perpetrator's gender or rank, this trial represented a turning point in legal history, leaving a legacy of justice and personal accountability that those who participated in genocide could never erase. After more than 1 week of deliberation, the tribunal at Lüneburg delivered its final verdict against the 3 female guards. Irma Grese and Elizabeth Vulkenrath were convicted of mass murder, torture, and ill-treatment of prisoners, and sentenced to the maximum penalty, hanging. Johanna Borman received an identical sentence, despite her involvement in some acts being less severe, but still sufficient to warrant the death penalty. The courtroom atmosphere was stifling and tense as the presiding judge announced the sentences. Grese maintained a resolute demeanor, her eyes flashing defiantly at her accusers. Vulkenrath appeared stunned and incredulous at the irrevocable decision, and Borman seemed shocked, dazed, unable to grasp the fate awaiting her. On the day of sentencing, the defendants retained the right to appeal. Irma Grese immediately filed a motion to review all evidence and testimony, hoping for a change in the judgment. However, only a few days later, the Lüneburg tribunal dismissed her appeal, affirming that there was no basis to stay the execution of the sentence. The imposition of the death penalty carried strong deterrent effect, marking the first time women were executed under the highest wartime tribunal presided over by British authorities. Legal experts and public opinion largely supported the verdict, despite calls for greater leniency toward female offenders. Some defense attorneys argued that society should treat women more humanely, but both historical and judicial consensus prevailed. Justice does not discriminate on the basis of gender. At the close of the trial, the court archived detailed records of all criminal acts, witness statements, and the final judgment. This documentation was then forwarded to the United Nations, serving as essential reference material for subsequent international agreements on crimes against humanity. The Lüneburg sentences stood not merely as personal punishment, but as a historic milestone affirming the principle that anyone, male or female, high-ranking or low, who commits serious human rights violations has no safe harbor under international law. The legacy of this trial helped lay the groundwork for post-Second World War international justice. The execution of the 3 female guards sent a powerful message. Neither humanity nor the rule of law can be set aside, even under the most brutal circumstances of war. From this point forward, the principles of individual accountability and human rights became cornerstones of the United Nations Charter and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, inaugurating a new era in the fight for justice on behalf of victims of all forms of atrocity. On the 13th of December 1945, The 3 women were transferred to Hamelin prison to await execution. The hangman, Albert Pierre Point, dubbed the death of war criminals, arrived early to measure their heights and weights, calculating the precise drop of the noose to ensure instantaneous death and minimize suffering. Irma Grese, the youngest, appeared with a mocking smile as her name was read, her eyes still flashing defiance. Elizabeth Vulkenrath stepped onto the scaffold in silence, her gaze distant as though releasing her pain, while Johanna Borman trembled, uttering a brief final statement, "I have feelings," before bowing her head for the moment of truth. The hanging procedure was conducted with professional solemnity and without fanfare. 3 minutes of tense silence preceded the trapdoor's release, and the bodies of the condemned convulsed for a few seconds, reflecting the price paid for their cruel crimes. Immediately upon confirmation of death, the 3 bodies were swiftly cremated. Their ashes were scattered within the prison grounds to prevent any site from becoming a gathering place for fascist sympathizers. Among this small number of tragic endings, Grese made history as the youngest woman ever executed under British law, while Vulkenrath and Borman joined the rare ranks of women put to death in the war crimes trials, presided over by British authorities after the Second World War. Images of the 3 frail figures clad in prison garb, ascending the scaffold under cold lighting and the watchful eyes of guards circulated throughout Europe, shocking public opinion. International press outlets provided minute-by-minute coverage of their final moments, accompanied by analyses of the legal and ethical implications of executing women. This event marked the culmination of the process of holding female perpetrators of war crimes fully accountable, affirming the principle of zero tolerance for any individual, regardless of gender, who commits serious human rights violations. The most significant legacy of this trial and the subsequent executions is the powerful message it sent. International justice spares no one, and crimes against humanity must face commensurate consequences. Through the prosecution and execution of the 3 female guards, the world witnessed a pivotal moment in the evolution of international law. The principle of individual responsibility, irrespective of gender, was solidified like never before. From that point forward, the Lüneburg trial and the Hamelin executions stood as enduring symbols of the international community's resolve to ensure that no one woman or man, regardless of rank, could evade accountability for genocide. That legacy continues to resonate within the legal framework of the United Nations and subsequent conventions, upholding humanitarian values and personal accountability as the unshakable pillars of global justice. Alongside the 3 female convicts who were executed, 8 male defendants received the same verdict. Joseph Kramer, later nicknamed the Belsen Monster, and Dr. Havens Tevenseven de Vlegend. Fritz Klein, along with 5 other camp guards, SS nurses, and soldiers. The tribunal found that Kramer had directly administered the camp from the winter of 1944, overseeing all detention operations, forced labor, and the selection that sent hundreds of thousands of prisoners to their deaths by violence or starvation. Dr. Fritz Klein, as the camp physician, abused his medical authority to determine who was fit for work and who should be sent to the gas chambers. And he was sentenced to hanging alongside Kramer. In addition to these 2 central figures, the court convicted an SS lieutenant colonel in charge of internal security and the guards who took part in the death march, forcing prisoners into formation in harsh weather before beating them to death with rubber truncheons, as well as 5 SS nurses who had refused to distribute food and medicine to the sick. They were all sentenced to death for mass murder, torture, and ill treatment of prisoners. With witness statements, crime scene photographs, and film evidence providing undeniable proof of their crimes, the trial concluded with the image of 8 male criminals ascending the scaffold, an event seldom mentioned, but serving as clear evidence of the brutality of men within the concentration camp system. Albert Pierre Point and his assistants maintained a calm, professional demeanor as they measured height and weight and calculated the drop for each noose, demonstrating the respect they accorded the legal process. Even as they dealt with the most heinous offenders, the executions were carried out in a single morning session, beginning with Joseph Kramer, followed by Dr. Fritz Klein, and the remaining male prisoners. Their bodies were immediately cremated, and the ashes scattered within the prison grounds to prevent any site from becoming a gathering place for extremist sympathizers. This event marked the first time a group of male war criminals, including camp commanders and physicians, were simultaneously sentenced and executed, underscoring the British authorities' determination to hold every level of perpetrator accountable. Regardless of gender or rank, the entire process from interrogation and trial to execution reflected the professionalism of the British justice system and its resolve to ensure that crimes against humanity are met with justice at every level. Whether the perpetrators were male or female, high-ranking or low-ranking, anyone responsible for serious human rights violations had no safe harbor. The Lüneburg trial and the Hamelin executions have become enduring symbols of personal accountability and the unwavering principle of international justice during one of the darkest chapters in human history. Not all camp personnel received the death penalty. 19 other defendants were handed prison sentences ranging from 1 year to life imprisonment. Among these were several women whose assaultive behavior was well documented, yet insufficient to secure convictions for direct homicide. The disparity in sentencing sparked immediate controversy. Why were some brutal abusers spared execution while others were not? As the geopolitical landscape shifted into the Cold War, additional clemency, petitions, and sentence reductions emerged. West Germany's strategic importance prompted Allied authorities to prioritize diplomatic relations over strict retributive justice. Consequently, a handful of these convicted guards benefited from early release programs in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Some had already served just a fraction of their original terms before being returned to civilian life. This early release provoked outrage among many former prisoners who continued to suffer psychological and physical scars from their internment. Survivors protested that justice felt incomplete when perpetrators of severe abuse walked free after only a few years behind bars. They pointed to cases where low-ranking camp staff evaded capture altogether by fleeing the camp during the chaos of liberation, never facing trial or imprisonment. The inconsistency undermined confidence in the fairness of the post-war legal process. Public debates raged across newspapers, academic circles, and political forums. Was justice truly served if those most complicit in violence escaped severe punishment? Critics argued that a penal system influenced by diplomatic expediency betrayed the victims and their memories. They contended that life sentences should have been non-parallelable, and that any early release signaled moral compromise. Others cautioned that the nascent federal republic needed to rebuild its society, including reintegrating less culpable individuals, to stabilize its workforce. Legal scholars also weighed in, dissecting the evidentiary thresholds for murder versus assault charges. They noted that proving direct intent to kill often proved difficult, pushing prosecutors to rely on broader counts of crimes against humanity that carried lesser sentences. This gap left many believing that the legal definitions themselves were inadequate to capture the full spectrum of atrocities committed. In parallel, some lower-ranking staff guards, clerks, orderlies slipped through the judicial cracks altogether, capitalizing on the confusion of surrender to vanish back into civilian populations across Europe and even South America. Efforts to extradite and prosecute these missing figures met with limited success, as many countries were reluctant to reopen old wounds or lacked the political will to pursue distant, aging suspects. By the mid-1950s, a worrisome pattern had crystallized. The most infamous perpetrators had been executed, but a substantial number of lesser-known, but still violent collaborators had resumed ordinary lives. This fragmented post-war justice left survivors questioning whether the trials offered genuine closure or merely served as symbolic gestures. The unresolved discontent highlighted the tension between legal pragmatism and moral reckoning, underscoring that, for many victims, the search for accountability extended far beyond any single verdict. As Allied forces swept through Nazi territory and the war drew to a close, hundreds of camp staff seized the opportunity to slip away, vanishing into the chaos of evacuation and surrender. Some fled westward into the hearts of liberated Europe, while others boarded ships bound for South America or found refuge in the Middle East. They benefited from an established network of war criminal facilitators, an underground railway that provided false papers, safe houses, and clandestine passage to distant shores. Meanwhile, several countries took up the task of prosecuting those who had not escaped. France convened trials for guards and functionaries implicated in atrocities on French soil and in satellite camps. In Poland, special tribunals heard cases against medium and lower-ranking personnel involved in deportations and factory labor massacres. The Soviet Union conducted numerous summary hearings, sentencing many defendants to long prison terms or even execution, often with limited adherence to due process. Smaller European states, from the Netherlands to Czechoslovakia, also held their own court proceedings for locally captured suspects. Yet these efforts suffered from a lack of coordination. Each nation pursued its own roster of names, applying divergent legal standards and evidentiary rules. Trials ranged from full military tribunals with extensive documentation to hasty kangaroo courts, where defendants had scant opportunity for defense. The result was a patchwork of judgments that left major gaps. Some notorious figures faced multiple prosecutions, while others never stood before any court. By the late 1950s, estimates suggested that only about 60% of identified suspects had been formally indicted. Of those, a substantial portion received lenient sentences, parole, or early release as political priorities shifted during the Cold War. The remaining 40%, many of whom had served as low-level guards or administrative staff, managed to evade justice entirely. They assimilated quietly into post-war society, under assumed identities or with their wartime activities obscured by bureaucratic confusion. Efforts to coordinate international action, such as through Interpol or the newly formed United Nations War Crimes Commission, yielded limited success. Political exigencies often trumped legal imperatives. Governments reluctant to reopen wartime wounds prioritized economic reconstruction and diplomatic relations over exhaustive manhunts. High-profile extraditions occasionally made headlines, but full-scale cooperation remained sporadic and incomplete. For survivors and victims' families, this fragmentation represented a betrayal of justice. Letters flooded newspapers, and human rights organizations decried the missing perpetrators who walked free. Memorial foundations and veterans associations called for renewed efforts to identify and extradite fugitives. But these campaigns faced bureaucratic inertia and fading public attention as Europe's reconstruction and the emergent Cold War took center stage. In subsequent decades, renewed investigations in Germany and elsewhere, sparked by new archives and surviving testimonies, led to a handful of late prosecutions. But many cases were dismissed due to statutes of limitations or insufficient evidence. The legacy of these fragmented trials endures as a warning. Without unified legal mechanisms and unwavering political will, the pursuit of war criminals can falter, leaving a permanent stain on the promise of universal accountability. The Bergen Belsen trial and the subsequent proceedings played a pivotal role in shaping the modern framework for international criminal law. In the aftermath of the Second World War, legal scholars and statesmen recognized that the sheer scale and systematic nature of atrocities demanded a permanent international mechanism to prevent and punish such crimes. This realization culminated in the adoption of the United Nations Protocol in 1948, which gave birth to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. For the first time, this treaty enshrined the principle that every individual, regardless of gender, bears personal criminal responsibility under international law. No higher orders could absolve someone from prosecution for genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. The trial of the Bergen Belsen female guards shattered long-standing myths about the limitations of cruelty by holding Irma Grese, Elisabeth Vulkenrath, and Johanna Borman to account on the same footing as their male counterparts. The tribunal forged a new understanding. Atrocity transcends any notion of a safe zone based on gender. This precedent reinforced the idea that women, too, could be architects of systematic violence. Subsequent tribunals and commissions drew upon this principle when indicting and prosecuting female perpetrators, ensuring that no one could hide behind assumptions of female passivity or victimhood. In the decade that followed, the legal and moral implications of these trials inspired a broad cultural reckoning. Filmmakers turned to Bergen Belsen's records to tell stories that emphasized the universality of human cruelty. Documentaries and feature films portrayed the horrors witnessed at the camp, spotlighting the roles of its female overseers. Authors produced influential histories and memoirs, drawing on court transcripts and survivor testimonies to underscore how ideology and personal choice combined to enable genocide. Holocaust museums opened new galleries with dossiers on these trials, presenting artifacts, photographs, and affidavits in immersive exhibitions that drove home the lesson. The capacity for evil knows no cultural or biological boundary. Academic conferences and human rights seminars repeatedly referenced the Bergen Belsen verdict when debating the development of international tribunals. This dialogue contributed directly to the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda decades later. Legal practitioners pointed to 1948 as the moment when the world community first codified a comprehensive duty to prevent and punish genocide. The notion that both men and women could serve as judges and perpetrators in such proceedings became an integral part of training programs for international judges, prosecutors, and defense counsel. Beyond courts and lecture halls, public education campaigns leveraged the historical legacy of these trials. School curricula incorporated case studies of female guards to challenge gender stereotypes, encouraging students to examine how ordinary individuals become complicit in extraordinary crimes. Non-governmental organizations working against gender-based violence invoked the Bergen Belsen precedent to advocate for equal accountability in all forms of abuse, pressing for reforms in national laws that too often treated female perpetrators more leniently. Ultimately, the legal legacy and global awareness born of the Bergen Belsen trial reaffirmed a universal message. No one man or woman stands immune to prosecution for crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. This enduring lesson has become a cornerstone of contemporary international justice, ensuring that the principles of individual responsibility and equality before the law remain unshakable pillars in the ongoing struggle to uphold human dignity. Through this video, viewers not only witness the brutal historical events, but also learn profound lessons about human nature and the value of justice. The images of the 3 female guards of Bergen Belsen, once dismissed as peripheral elements, revealed them to be as cruel as any of their male counterparts, reminding us that power can easily turn people into savages when unchecked by conscience. The video's central message is clear. Crimes against humanity spare no one, regardless of gender or rank, and no individual can evade criminal and moral responsibility. Although the war receded into the past over 7 decades ago, its consequences endure: the survivors' pain, the evidence of atrocities, and the physical and psychological scars that will never fully heal. The physical, spiritual, social, and cultural devastation wrought by concentration camps and the Holocaust continues to remind us that peace is an invaluable asset that must be cherished and protected at all costs. Living in times of peace. What should we do? First, we must appreciate our freedoms, our human rights, and the opportunity to make our voices heard. Next, we must not remain silent in the face of injustice whenever we witness violence, racism, or human rights abuses. Each of us bears the responsibility to speak up, intervene, or support the victims. In a world still riddled with conflicts from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, from parts of Africa to regions in Asia, we must draw the lessons of history. Modern warfare may differ in technology and scale, but its brutality and tragic consequences remain unchanged. This video reminds us that every decision and every word can either help heal or deepen the wounds of war. As global citizens, we need to strengthen peace education, support multilateral diplomacy, and work tirelessly to build effective international mechanisms that prevent conflicts before they erupt. Above all, we must not let history repeat itself. We must uphold the most fundamental values: compassion, tolerance, and personal responsibility. Only when each individual dares to defend the right to life, liberty, and human dignity can we truly deserve the peace that so many generations have sacrificed to secure. This video, with its harrowing yet essential story, stands as a powerful call to continuous action for a fairer, freer, and more humane world.